Welcome back. I hope you are doing awesome. In the previous lecture, we understood different execution modes. As a part of this lecture, we'll understand what is the life cycle of Spark application outside the Spark. Let's get started. First step is user submitting a pre-compiled jar application to the cluster manager. At this point, we are executing the code on the local machine. So we are going to make a request to the cluster manager to allocate the resources. After that, the cluster manager accepts the request from the user and places the driver process in one of the worker node of the cluster. That is one of the step after a user submits a request to the cluster manager. After the cluster manager places the driver process in one of the worker node of the cluster, application which has submitted the code will be off and the cluster is on its own now. Now we understand that driver process is placed in the cluster. That driver process will start running the user code. Whenever the user submits a code, that should include a Spark session that initializes the Spark cluster. So that is one of the very important aspect. When it says Spark cluster, that should include both the driver and executors. Now, if you look at the situation we are in, the user has requested the resource to the cluster manager. The cluster manager has accepted that request and it has placed the driver process in one of the worker node of the cluster. That is where we are in now. Now what happens is Spark session in this driver process communicates with the cluster manager and it will ask, hey cluster manager, please go ahead and allocate the executor processes for me. Then cluster manager responds and it allocates the executor processes for the driver process. At this point, we have a driver process, we have a executor process, we have a fully functional Spark cluster. Just to go through the steps again, user submits the request to the cluster manager. Cluster manager initiates the driver processes one of the worker node of the cluster. Then the Spark session in the driver process communicates with the cluster manager asking for the executors. Then cluster manager accepts the request and it will allocate the executors to the driver process. That becomes a fully functional Spark cluster now. One of the important aspect is all these relevant configurations need to be set during the submission process as a part of the command line arguments. Like what is the cluster manager you are using? In this case, we are using yarn. What is the deployment mode? Is it a cluster mode or a client mode? And what is the executor memory? And how many executors you would need? And also you should specify the files or you can specify the file with the path as well. This configuration should be set by the user during the submission of the Spark application. We have a fully functional cluster. So what should happen now? As we know, each of the worker nodes would have a data, isn't it? Data 2, worker node 3, data 3 are partitions of the data. Now that Spark has a fully functional cluster, what it does is it executes the code sent by the driver process. Then we have a driver process. The code which is sent by the driver process is executed by all the executors. While doing so, the data will move from one place to another place depending upon the type of the code you have written. Driver schedules the tasks, executors executes the code by moving the data around, and once the work is done, executors or workers respond to the driver with the status. Is it fail or is it success? Now that distributed processing of the data is completed, whatever the Spark application you have written, that has executed its code across the executors in a different worker nodes. Then what should happen? After the completion of the task, driver process exits the worker node with the either success or failure message. Then cluster manager shuts down all the executors because that memory and resources need to be freed up for the next upcoming task, right? Just to summarize what we discussed, user submits the code to the cluster manager. Cluster manager allocates the driver process. Driver process in turn communicates with the cluster manager. Cluster manager allocates the executors. After that, driver process will schedule the task to the executors. Executors will start executing and they process the data and they send the results to the driver process. After the processing is done, driver process exits and cluster manager shuts down the executors. Awesome. You have a wonderful time. Thank you.